Have you ever wondered how a single federal judge can sometimes stop a government policy across the entire United States with just one ruling? It's one of the most powerful and controversial tools in the American legal system. But now, the U.S. Supreme Court has issued a major decision that could reshape how that power is used going forward. Legal experts are calling it one of the most important procedural rulings in years, and regardless of your political views, its impact could reach immigration, elections, environmental regulations, gun laws, and many other areas of American life. Today, we're breaking down what the court actually decided, why the case reached the Supreme Court, what nationwide injunctions are, why they've become so controversial, and what this decision could mean for future lawsuits across the country. Rather than focusing on political talking points, we're going to explain the ruling in plain English so you can understand why constitutional scholars, attorneys, and government officials are paying such close attention. Before we begin, if you enjoy clear explanations of important Supreme Court decisions, constitutional issues, and major legal developments, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. These cases often shape how government operates for years, yet many of the most significant rulings receive surprisingly little detailed explanation. Our goal is to make these complex legal topics understandable without requiring a law degree. To understand why this decision matters so much, we first need to answer a basic question. What exactly is a nationwide injunction? Most court cases involve a dispute between specific parties. Someone believes they were harmed, they file a lawsuit, and if they win, the court provides relief to those individuals. But over the last several decades, federal courts increasingly issued orders that reached far beyond the people actually involved in the lawsuit. In some cases, a single district judge would temporarily prevent the federal government from enforcing a policy anywhere in the country while the litigation continued. Supporters argued this prevented unconstitutional policies from affecting millions of people. Critics argued it gave enormous national power to individual trial judges before the legal issues had been fully resolved. That disagreement has existed for years, crossing political lines. Administrations of both major political parties have challenged nationwide injunctions when they blocked their policies, while often relying on the same legal tool when it benefited their own positions. As a result, many legal scholars, judges, and constitutional experts have questioned whether the practice had expanded beyond what federal courts were originally intended to do. The Supreme Court's latest decision addresses that very issue, and its answer could significantly change how future challenges to federal policies move through the courts. Understanding the court's reasoning requires separating two ideas that are often confused. The first is whether a government policy is lawful or unlawful. The second is how broad a court's order should be while that question is being decided. Those are two very different issues. A policy might ultimately be ruled unconstitutional, but that doesn't automatically answer whether one district court should have the authority to stop that policy nationwide before every legal question has been fully resolved. That distinction became the center of this case, and it's why so many legal experts have described the ruling as a procedural decision with enormous practical consequences. For years, nationwide injunctions became one of the most powerful tools in American litigation. Whether the issue involved immigration, environmental regulations, healthcare, education, firearms, business regulations, or election procedures, the strategy was often remarkably similar. A lawsuit would be filed in a federal district where the plaintiffs believed they had the strongest legal arguments, and if the judge granted nationwide relief, the challenged policy could effectively be paused across the entire country while appeals worked their way through the courts. Sometimes those appeals lasted months, sometimes they stretched into years. During that entire period, policies approved by elected officials could remain blocked, not because the Supreme Court had ruled on the merits, but because one lower federal court had issued a broad preliminary order. Supporters of nationwide injunctions argued that this approach prevented confusion. They believed it would make little sense for a federal policy to apply in one state but not another, while litigation continued. If a court believed a policy was likely unlawful, they argued, stopping it nationwide protected everyone equally until the legal process reached a final conclusion. They also pointed out that without nationwide relief, different Americans could temporarily receive different legal treatment depending solely on where they lived, creating uncertainty for businesses, government agencies, and ordinary citizens alike. Critics, however, viewed the issue very differently. They argued that federal district courts were created to resolve disputes between specific parties, not to function as nationwide policymakers. According to this view, a district judge's responsibility is to provide relief to the people who actually brought the lawsuit, rather than issuing orders affecting millions of Americans who were never involved in the case. Many constitutional scholars warned that allowing individual trial judges to halt nationwide policies encouraged strategic litigation, where groups searched for jurisdictions they believed would be most favorable to their legal arguments, rather than allowing different courts to independently evaluate the same issue over time. The Supreme Court's recent decision signals that these concerns deserve serious attention. While every future case will depend on its own facts, the court emphasized that remedies issued by lower courts should generally be tailored to the injuries suffered by the plaintiffs before them. In other words, courts should carefully consider whether the scope of an injunction matches the dispute being decided, instead of automatically extending relief nationwide whenever a challenge is filed. That principle may sound technical, but its practical effects could reshape litigation involving nearly every major federal policy for years to come. One reason this ruling has generated so much discussion is because it affects far more than a single administration or a single political issue. Every presidential administration, regardless of party, eventually faces lawsuits challenging executive actions or federal regulations. Every administration also benefits from judicial rulings in some cases while opposing them in others. Because of that, the court's decision establishes a framework that will likely influence presidents, governors, federal agencies, advocacy organizations, businesses, and state governments for many years, regardless of who controls Washington. The implications extend beyond government officials. Businesses that operate across multiple states may now find themselves navigating legal landscapes that evolve differently as cases proceed through different federal courts. State governments may gain greater flexibility to defend their own laws while litigation develops. Advocacy organizations on both sides of controversial issues may need to rethink how they structure lawsuits, knowing that obtaining immediate nationwide relief could become more difficult than it has been in recent years. In other words, this ruling doesn't end legal battles. It changes the rules under which many of those battles will be. Perhaps the most important point to remember is that this decision does not determine whether any particular federal policy is constitutional or unconstitutional. Those questions will continue to be litigated just as they always have. Instead, the court focused on who should receive relief during the litigation process and how broadly lower courts should exercise their equitable powers. It is a procedural ruling, but procedural rulings often have lasting consequences because they shape how every future lawsuit moves through the judicial system. In many respects, the rules governing litigation can become just as influential as the final decisions themselves. To understand why legal observers are paying such close attention to this ruling, it helps to think about what happens after a district court issues an injunction. In many high-profile cases, the legal battle doesn't end there, it is only beginning. Appeals move to the federal circuit courts, additional arguments are presented, and eventually some of the most significant disputes reach the Supreme Court. That process exists for a reason. The American judicial system was designed with multiple layers of review so that complicated constitutional questions receive careful consideration before becoming binding nationwide precedent. The Supreme Court's latest decision reinforces the idea that those higher courts, rather than individual trial courts, should often play the central role in determining issues with nationwide consequences. One of the biggest changes legal experts expect is a shift in litigation strategy. Attorneys representing states, advocacy organizations, businesses, and federal agencies will likely adjust how they approach future lawsuits. Instead of assuming that a single district court can immediately stop a policy across the entire country, legal teams may place greater emphasis on building strong factual records, pursuing broader class actions where appropriate, and preparing cases for appellate review much earlier in the process. In other words, this decision doesn't eliminate challenges to government action. It changes the path those challenges may need to follow. This ruling also highlights an important constitutional principle that has existed since the nation's founding: the separation of powers. Under the Constitution, Congress writes laws, the executive branch enforces them, and the judiciary interprets them when disputes arise. Those responsibilities sometimes overlap, but the system was intentionally designed so that no single branch accumulates unlimited authority. Throughout American history, debates over the balance of power have appeared in different forms, whether involving executive orders, federal regulations, congressional authority, or judicial review. This case becomes part of that larger constitutional conversation, reminding Americans that questions about institutional power often shape government just as much as debates over individual policies. Another consequence may be an increase in cases reaching the Supreme Court itself. If different federal appellate courts begin reaching different conclusions while applying this new framework, the Supreme Court may need to resolve those disagreements to ensure that federal law is interpreted consistently across the country. That's not unusual. Many landmark constitutional decisions began with conflicting rulings in lower courts before ultimately being resolved by the nation's highest court. Legal scholars expect that this decision could generate a number of important follow-up cases over the next several years as judges, lawyers, and government officials work through its practical application. For ordinary Americans, the immediate impact may not be obvious at first. Most people won't notice changes overnight in their daily routines. But over time, the effects could become increasingly visible whenever major federal policies are challenged in court. Instead of seeing a single district court immediately halt a nationwide policy, Americans may see legal disputes develop through a more gradual process, with different courts evaluating similar issues before higher courts provide definitive answers. That may create periods of uncertainty in some cases, but supporters argue it also allows constitutional questions to receive more complete judicial review before nationwide consequences take effect. It's also worth recognizing that this ruling does not eliminate judicial oversight of the federal government. Courts retain the authority to review executive actions, agency regulations, and congressional statutes when constitutional challenges are brought before them. Individuals, businesses, states, and organizations can still file lawsuits when they believe government action violates the Constitution or federal law. What changes is the discussion surrounding the scope of relief available while those cases remain pending. That distinction is critical because it separates the existence of judicial review from the breadth of judicial remedies. As this decision begins influencing future litigation, lawmakers in Congress and state legislatures may also find themselves under greater pressure to address controversial policy questions through legislation rather than relying on prolonged courtroom battles. Whether that leads to more bipartisan cooperation or simply shifts political conflict into legislative chambers remains to be seen. But many constitutional scholars agree on one point. Decisions about institutional power often have consequences that last much longer than debates over any single administration or policy. Long after today's political controversies have faded, this ruling may still be cited in courtrooms as judges determine how broadly lower federal courts should exercise their authority. That is why this case has attracted so much attention from legal experts. It isn't simply about one lawsuit or one administration. It's about defining the proper role of federal courts within America's constitutional framework. Cases like this remind us that some of the most consequential Supreme Court decisions are not always the ones that dominate headlines for a single news cycle. Instead, they are the procedural rulings that quietly reshape how the legal system operates for years or even decades to come. Now, here is where this story becomes even more important, because this ruling is not just about judges or lawyers. It is about the balance of power that affects ordinary Americans every single day, often without them even realizing it. Think about how many major national issues have been tied up in court over the last several years. Immigration policies, environmental regulations, firearm restrictions, election procedures, healthcare mandates, education policies, and countless executive actions have all been delayed, frozen, or completely stopped before the American people ever saw their full effects. In many of those situations, the actual policy debate never reached its conclusion because one federal judge issued an order that immediately applied across the entire country. That single order often became the story, while the constitutional questions underneath it were never fully resolved. According to the court's majority, that pattern allowed temporary court orders to become substitutes for permanent national policy. The justices emphasized that federal courts exist to resolve legal disputes between actual parties, not to govern the country through sweeping preliminary injunctions that reach millions of people who were never part of the lawsuit in the first place. The majority also pointed to something that constitutional scholars have debated for years: whether nationwide injunctions have any meaningful historical foundation. The court noted that for much of American history, judges generally limited their relief to the people actually before the court. The modern practice of issuing nationwide injunctions expanded dramatically only in recent decades, especially during highly polarized political administrations. As the court explained, this expansion was never clearly authorized by Congress and was never explicitly granted by the Constitution itself. That historical observation carries enormous significance because Supreme Court decisions often rely not only on current statutes, but also on historical legal traditions. When the court begins emphasizing original judicial limits, it signals that future decisions may continue moving in the same direction. This is why legal experts across the country are calling this one of the most important procedural rulings in years. The decision does not determine whether any particular immigration policy, environmental regulation, firearm restriction, or executive action is constitutional. Instead, it changes the rules governing how those fights proceed through the judicial system. That distinction matters because procedure often determines outcomes. If nationwide injunctions become much harder to obtain, federal policies may remain in effect much longer, while lawsuits move through appeals. That means administrations of either political party could implement policies that remain active for months or even years before receiving a final Supreme Court decision. Whether someone views that as positive or negative will likely depend on the specific policy involved, but the procedural shift itself affects everyone, regardless of political affiliation. Another important consequence involves Congress itself. For years, critics argued that lawmakers increasingly relied on courts to resolve political disputes instead of passing legislation. Difficult issues frequently stalled in Congress, while advocacy groups immediately filed lawsuits hoping judges would produce the outcome legislators could not. Several members of the court suggested, directly or indirectly, that this dynamic has weakened democratic accountability. If lawmakers know courts are less likely to halt controversial policies nationwide, pressure may increase on Congress to negotiate, compromise, and actually legislate instead of allowing federal courts to carry the burden of resolving every major national disagreement. Whether Congress responds that way remains uncertain, but the incentive structure has undeniably changed. State governments are also expected to rethink their legal strategies after this ruling. Attorneys general from both Republican-led and Democratic-led states have routinely sought nationwide injunctions whenever a presidential administration introduced policies they opposed. That legal playbook may now require significant revision. Instead of immediately asking a district court to stop a federal policy across the entire country, states may focus more heavily on obtaining relief limited to their own residents, while broader constitutional questions work their way toward the Supreme Court. Legal analysts expect an increase in state-specific litigation and a greater emphasis on carefully building factual records before cases reach appellate courts. Private organizations and advocacy groups face similar adjustments. Whether representing business interests, civil liberties organizations, environmental advocates, gun rights groups, healthcare associations, or election reform organizations, litigation strategies developed over the last decade may no longer produce the same results. Many organizations built entire legal departments around quickly obtaining nationwide injunctions from favorable jurisdictions. If those remedies become significantly narrower, organizations may invest more heavily in class action litigation, coordinated multi-state lawsuits, or expedited appeals to higher courts. The legal landscape itself has changed, and everyone who participates in it will have to adapt. One of the more interesting discussions surrounding this decision involves public confidence in the judiciary. Surveys over the past several years have shown declining trust in many American institutions, including Congress, federal agencies, and increasingly, the courts. Critics argued that repeated nationwide injunctions created the impression that individual judges were acting more like policymakers than neutral arbiters of law. Supporters of the court's decision believe limiting those injunctions could restore public confidence by reinforcing the idea that judges resolve disputes rather than create nationwide policy. Others worry that limiting injunctions may temporarily create inconsistent legal outcomes while different courts reach different conclusions. Regardless of which view ultimately proves correct, there is broad agreement that this decision will shape debates about judicial legitimacy for many years to come. For ordinary Americans, however, the most practical lesson is surprisingly simple. Major national policies may now stay in effect longer before being blocked by federal courts. That means changes involving immigration, taxes, environmental regulations, firearms, healthcare, elections, education, or executive actions may become effective while legal challenges continue, instead of being immediately frozen nationwide. In other words, Americans may begin experiencing policy changes first and court resolutions later. That represents a noticeable shift from what many people have grown accustomed to over the last decade. There is another aspect that deserves attention because it often gets overlooked in headlines. Supreme Court rulings rarely produce immediate dramatic changes overnight. Instead, they establish legal principles that gradually reshape thousands of future cases. Lower court judges study the reasoning, attorneys adjust their arguments, federal agencies revise their policies, and eventually an entirely new legal framework emerges. Some of the most influential Supreme Court decisions in history did not reveal their full impact until years later, as additional cases interpreted and expanded upon the original ruling. Many constitutional scholars believe this decision could follow that same path. Today's emergency order may become tomorrow's foundational precedent, cited in countless federal courtrooms across America. As future cases arrive before the Supreme Court, the justices will almost certainly be asked to clarify exactly when broader relief remains appropriate and when narrower relief is required. That means today's decision is probably not the final chapter, but rather the beginning of a much larger constitutional conversation. Lawyers, judges, lawmakers, and legal scholars will spend years debating its precise boundaries, and each new case will help define exactly how far this new doctrine extends. Ultimately, regardless of anyone's political views, this ruling serves as a reminder that the Constitution was designed around separated powers rather than concentrated authority. Congress writes laws. The president executes them. Courts interpret them. Whenever one branch begins assuming responsibilities that belong to another, constitutional tension inevitably follows. The Supreme Court's majority concluded that nationwide injunctions had allowed lower courts to exercise authority beyond their traditional judicial role. Whether history ultimately agrees with that assessment will be debated for decades, but there is little doubt that this decision marks a significant turning point in the ongoing discussion about the proper limits of judicial power. As Americans continue following future legal battles, one thing has become increasingly clear. Constitutional procedure is no longer an issue discussed only inside law schools. It affects how quickly government policies take effect, how long legal challenges last, and ultimately how every citizen experiences the decisions made in Washington and across the states. Understanding those procedural rules is becoming just as important as understanding the policies themselves, because the rules increasingly determine how and when those policies reach the public. So here's the bottom line. The Supreme Court's emergency ruling is not simply another headline in the daily news cycle. It represents a significant shift in how federal courts may handle major constitutional disputes moving forward. The decision doesn't settle every legal battle, but it changes the battlefield itself. Whether future administrations are Republican or Democrat, whether the issue involves immigration, elections, firearms, healthcare, or environmental policy, the path those disputes take through the courts may never look quite the same again. The months ahead will reveal how lower courts apply this decision, how Congress responds, and whether future Supreme Court rulings continue moving in this direction. One thing is certain: the legal landscape has changed, and anyone who wants to understand where the country is headed should be paying close attention. If you found this breakdown helpful, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because these constitutional developments often move quickly and they're rarely explained in plain English. Share this video with someone who wants to stay informed about the biggest legal changes affecting America today. And in the comments below, tell me what you think this ruling will impact the most: immigration, gun rights, elections, federal agencies, or something else entirely. I'd love to hear your perspective, and I'll see you in the next video.